Hey, welcome to the extras video for the 8-ball machine. This video is just some alternate angles and test footage and behind the scenes stuff that you don't really see all that well in the main video. As of recording this, I have not yet filmed the Making Connections episode, but I imagine most of the stuff I talk about here will come up in that episode, so this is just kind of supplementary material in video form, because a lot of things are much easier to explain in video. That said though, it doesn't matter which one you see first. It's not like you have to watch that before this or anything like that. Don't worry about it. Alright, let's get into it. In case you didn't realize, the premise of the entire machine is expanding the concept of a billiard ball chain into the form of an entire machine. Billiard ball chains have been somewhat of an exciting discovery for the community over the last few years, and they've been done in a number of different ways, but the most common iteration seems to be to have a trick that takes a bunch of billiard balls and orders them into a sequence and then reacts that line at the end. Because billiard ball chains are typically done on a small scale like this, the size of the gaps in between the balls is often kept relatively small as well, which also results in a really satisfying boom kind of motion and sound. But the inspiration for this machine actually came from the realization that you could increase the space in between the balls by quite a large margin and it will still work, which led to the idea of building a billiard ball chain the size of an entire table, which led to the idea of building in turns and corners to make a more interesting path, which led to the idea of building an actual machine inside the gaps left over by that path, which led to the idea of having the machine itself actually build the billiard ball chain by depositing each of the balls into their specific locations as it went. So that's the idea, but the first step in actually building this machine was to lay out the path for the billiard ball chain, which leads me to the first of 3 rules that I laid out for myself during the building of the machine. I wanted each of the billiard balls to have its own discrete section, and I didn't want any of those sections to cross over the central billiard ball chain path. In other words, the motion of the machine stays on one side or the other of that central path, and the only time that it's allowed to switch sides is when each of the balls gets deposited into its holding cell, which triggers the next ball on the opposite side of the main path. Before I started actually building the main billiard ball chain line, I needed to make sure this plan was actually feasible. So I sketched out this early layout of the general shape of the main billiard ball chain, and more importantly, where each of the sections would go, keeping in mind that each of them were on one side of the line or the other, and that there was an equal number of sections on either side of the line so that there could be a viable path of motion throughout the entire machine that actually alternated sides each time like I wanted. This layout was mostly just a sketch to make sure that this idea was even possible, and I referred back to it mostly just as a general guideline for where each of the sections would go, but I didn't hold myself to it too strictly. That said though, the final machine ended up resembling this plan pretty closely. In fact, it's pretty much spot on, aside from the solid orange, solid red section, as well as the section where striped purple, striped blue, and striped red all have to share a really small corner. The second rule that I laid out for myself while making this machine was for all of the tricks to be more or less self-powered. I wanted each of the billiard balls to really be the center of attention. So I wanted them to be the main cause of as much motion in the machine as possible. I didn't want a bunch of extra connections happening all over the machine, like other balls on track, or string pulls, or lever releases, because I felt that they would be distracting, and they would take your eye off of following each of the main billiard balls. The solid orange path is a great example of this. In essence, there are really 3 motions happening here. There's the main motion of the sliding track and the falling tube, but there's also the motion of the wooden track tilting in the opposite direction, and there's the motion of the little gate at the end of the wooden track getting removed. The way I saw it, there were 2 approaches to building this trick. One approach, which might have technically been easier, would be to have 3 separate connections for each of those 3 motions. But the challenge I set for myself was to try the other approach, which is to make the billiard ball itself cause all 3 of those motions, thus eliminating the need for a bunch of extra connections. Finally, the third rule I set for myself was to avoid having any weights fall off the table, including the traditional technique of having a domino fall off the table and pull a string. My reasoning behind this rule is a lot less clear than it is for the other 2. Around halfway through building, I realized that I didn't have any dominoes falling off the table, or any weights at all, and from there it just became a challenge to see if I could build an entire machine like that. The real challenge ended up being whether I could make a machine like that without anybody noticing. Turns out it's not actually all that difficult to avoid using domino and string connections, but it is difficult to do that in a way that looks natural. There are three things that need to happen at the beginning of this machine, and they all need to work together. I need to hold the camera, I need to have one hand in the shot to hold the pool cue, and I need to control the movement of the pool cue, which would seemingly require three hands? Unless I control the movement of the pool cue with my foot. So that's what's inside this mysterious black box. It's two wheels that pinch the pool cue with the help of a rubber band, and as they roll, they push the pool cue inward and outward. There's a string around one of those wheels that goes through a pulley, and there's another string attached to the pool cue itself that goes through another pulley. Both of those strings then lead down to the floor where they connect to a lever that I can operate with my foot, almost like a gas pedal in a car. When I push my foot forward, it pushes the pool cue forward, and when I tilt my foot back, it retracts the pool cue. This allows a nice natural motion and allows you to do that kind of forward back shoot that you see in the video. This little doodad here on the edge of the table is actually a shock absorber, which helps slow down the weight as it reaches its final position so that the structure kind of eases into position. Normally this kind of thing just makes the trick look more elegant and look more smooth, but in this case it actually makes the trick work, because without it, the ball just bounces out early, which defeats the whole purpose of the trick. Here's a better look at the connection system for the Jacob's Ladder Zigzag boards. This was definitely one of the most challenging things to figure out about this entire machine, just because there are a ton of limitations for where the connections can be put. It looks complicated, but it helps to keep in mind that all I really need to do is get from the yellow ball to releasing this lever which flips the boards. Normally, an obvious solution to a problem like this would be to have the yellow ball hit a lever, but I actually can't put any levers around here, at least none of the traditional kind. I can't put a lever above the zigzag boards because they would be in the way of the flipping motion, and I can't put any levers below the boards because one of them actually dips down below as it flips over. Keep in mind there's also the string and the flexing parallelogram structure that are in the way, so that leaves only this really small gap between the boards and the flexing parallelogram. The solution I ended up going with was this little lever here that the yellow ball presses down slightly as it rolls over the transition between the zigzag boards and the red platform. There's a string attached to the other end of this lever which connects to this pre-toppled domino which always pulls it in that direction. The lever is able to stay in a horizontal position initially because of this support that's weighted in such a way that it will fall away once the ball presses down on the other side. And finally, once the weight of the ball has been removed from the other side of the lever, the pre-toppled domino goes to pull it back to its original position, but because the support's no longer there, it overshoots and pulls it to a completely vertical position, which is exactly where it needs to be, because that's pretty much the only orientation that won't interfere with the flipping zigzag board. That's the motion that pulls the string for the metal marble to roll down and hit the release mechanism. Moving on to the auto tilt train trick. In the main video, you can't really tell how the tilting mechanism is actually powered. There's a string attached to the left end of the track that goes through a couple of pulleys and leads off the table where it's attached to a bunch of weights. The track is held in its initial position by this connects rod resting on top of this mini dice. When the large domino falls and hits the table, it's actually pulling a string attached to this connects rod, which slides it out just enough for the dice to pass through. The reason the domino is strong enough to do that is because there is a very strong magnet attached to the end of it, and the table is actually metal. Not the gray table covering that you can actually see, but the table underneath that I put it on. The magnet adds some extra weight, which helps, but the real reason that the domino is strong enough to pull the connects rod is because of that snap that happens when it magnetizes with the table. It's not easy to tell how the snapping rubber band tracks are actually triggered, and that was intentional. I wanted the motion to be as surprising as possible, so I made the release mechanism as subtle and unpredictable as possible so that you don't see it coming. This trick is obviously based on the classic rubber band and capla trick, and if you've ever built it yourself, you'll know that it doesn't take much to get it to snap. The first track is held in place by this mini tape measure, which is latched onto this lever here, and when the lever is released at just the right moment, it retracts and catches on the end of the capla block, which is all it needs to start going. The second track is actually triggered by the first track. This dice here presses against the second pair of caplas as the first pair swings around. What's curious curious about this trick is that the two mini tracks mounted on top of each pair of caplas actually have to shift into place to form a straight line. Each of them is mounted onto a connex rod which can slide from side to side through a connector. The actual shifting motion is caused by the sheer speed at which they travel, or more accurately, how quickly they stop. But if I do it slowly, you can tell what would happen if they didn't shift. The tracks simply don't line up. They don't form a straight line. Here's a nice slow motion shot where you can really tell that when the caplas stop, the tracks mounted on top actually keep moving for just a little bit longer, just so that everything lines up. Here's a look at what's going on behind the rolling disc. You can see there's a weight that falls off the wheel and into a cup around halfway through the rotation. And that's there because the wheel needed enough power to pick up the yellow ball, but once it did, it couldn't stay attached to the wheel or else it would be too heavy on that side for it to continue rolling. Let's take a look at what you don't see in the elevator and sliding cart trick. Once the green ball exits the elevator, it actually needs a ton of weight to pull the cart back to the front of the table. The weight is actually sitting on a small ledge mounted a couple inches below the table surface. When the cart rolls into position to catch the green ball, it's actually tightening the string just enough to pull the weight off of the ledge. And the weight falling off the ledge is obviously what pulls the cart back to the front of the table with the green ball on it. Finally, I wanted to share how I created the really nice lighting effect that I gave the machine for the final take. There's actually a lamp that's mounted on a stick that hangs below the table surface and shines against the brick wall. I had to put a paper towel over the lamp to dim the light slightly, but I really like the effect that it gives the machine where it looks like the wall behind it is almost glowing, kind of. I think it really helps set apart the foreground from the background in a really interesting way, and I'm proud of how it looks. Thanks for watching. If you want to go back to the main video, you can click right here. If you want to check out that Making Connections episode that I did about this machine featuring the RGM Guy 01, you can click right here. And if you want to subscribe to my channel, you can click right here. That's it for me. I'm Jack of All Spades 98, and I'll see you in the next video.